This podcast is brought to you by Al Jazeera.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, Ethiopia in 1984.
Into the worst human disaster for a decade.
And in 2009.
And the harvest is ruined.
It's been 25 years since the famine, the story, then and now. More shots fired in the war between pro-Kremlin Russians and the Western media reporting that story. Newspaper circulation in America has been falling, and the situation is going from bad to worse. And politicians speaking and singing in harmony.
We must embrace a new era of engagement
For a change. We are devoting the bulk of this week's broadcast to a story that came out of Africa 25 years ago. And we're asking why it is that we are not seeing much of the same kind of news being reported today. The story was Ethiopia and the famine that killed 1 million people there. Millions more would have starved had the story not been reported in such a compelling way on Britain's BBC. One initial 7-minute story created a ripple effect in the global news media, resulting in one of the most successful relief efforts the world has ever mounted. But that's just about it for the feel-good factor. People are still starving, not just in Africa, but since that watershed report in 1984, news of famines and food crises often fails to make it onto our television screens or into print. Our starting point this week, the news report that helped save millions, its legacy for the media, and the question, if people starving to death aren't news in 2009, what is?
On the almost unbelievable horror of people without food, without hope.
The coverage of the 1984 Ethiopian famine was a hugely important media milestone.
Ethiopia, scenes of famine and death, now familiar to television viewers.
It definitely set a new standard for everybody because nobody had ever seen anything of this scale before.
A biblical famine, now in the 20th century.
When Bob Geldof saw that, something moved inside him to go and do Band-Aid.
And then Live Aid, and that meant that a whole lot of money that wouldn't otherwise have gone towards aid was able to get into Ethiopia.
The first emergency aid from Australia to famine-stricken Ethiopia leaves Melbourne tomorrow.
News editors could no longer ignore the fact that famine was something that people were interested in seeing about, were deeply affected by.
Or could they? One of the lasting journalistic legacies of the Ethiopia story was that it did set new standards of scale that subsequent food shortages could not possibly measure up to.
It sort of set the bar, and that became a challenge because we have many, many food shortages in Ethiopia over the years. The droughts now come in cycles quicker and quicker. And so what happened is we had to prep people ahead of time and say, look, you're not going to find those kinds of images, but yes, you're going to find starvation, you're going to find people that are thin and need food desperately, but it's not on the scale of what you were expecting.
Ironically, it made disaster coverage more difficult. Every news editor then asked a question afterwards, is this as big as Ethiopia? And that was something that journalists always had to consider.
If the disaster is big enough, the media will come. Martin Seemungle covered Ethiopia in 1984 for Canadian television.
The first thing you notice when you walk into this village is all the plowed fields.
Earlier this year, he did what not enough journalists do. He went back to the country to see what has been done there to prevent history repeating itself.
One of the things the media has to do more of is they've got to get in and do more of these stories that tell the story behind the story. They can't just go in whenever there's a crisis, because first of all, people go, well, where did that come from? Why is there a crisis? It comes down to agriculture, it comes down to irrigation, it comes down to electricity. They don't have any of those things. Why don't they have any of those things? Well, the question I have is, why isn't the media telling that story?
These crops should have been enough to sustain an entire family for about a year.
The media coverage has been more on the front end of the problem. Once famine has struck and once it begins taking the human toll. On the fact that these famines have other social, political and other historical problems has not been presented to the wider public. So this part of the coverage, the back end of it, has been missing.
that's something that I think we've all have learned. We have to be responsible, and we have to actually educate the media, and hopefully bring in the media sooner. Because what happens oftentimes is the media come when it's sort of too late. And they can play a very, very important role in sensitizing the world. So we have learned, I think, to try and utilize the media's interest earlier on, get them in, help them raise the awareness of what could be an impending disaster.
And even when disaster strikes and people go hungry, food shortages, even famines, often fail to attract as much coverage as other humanitarian disasters, especially on television.
I think it's more difficult to get famines on TV than it used to be. I mean, if you look at the kind of coverage we've seen in recent times, it tends to be earthquakes.
And yes, the Indonesian authorities are really struggling at this time to cope with the scale of the disaster.
Tsunamis, floods.
A powerful tropical storm has dumped more than a month's worth of rain in just 12 hours, killing at least 240
You get very dramatic pictures of people
so
suffering, whereas the dreadful thing about famine is a lot of the time it's people warning in advance, this is what will happen, people will die if we don't do something to help it. But you don't get those very dramatic pictures until very, very far down the line.
And by then, it's too late. The trick for aid workers will always be getting the media interested, getting the aid before a potential humanitarian disaster becomes one.
Considering the global economic crisis and that it's going to be that much more difficult for people to commit to food aid, I think any coverage is going to be really valuable because it will highlight a problem that needs financial support from the global community.
Welcome back. We have breaking news. A 7.9 magnitude earthquake striking.
It's very frustrating that the media does have such a short attention span if they can even focus on a humanitarian crisis. We're using every tool that we have, video, all sorts of YouTube, all sorts of mechanisms to try and get the message out. We can't rely on the traditional media anymore.
The political situation here is now in a very dangerous deadlock.
For the international media, they will go where the big story is. That's the only budget that they have these days, is to cover the very big stories, not to come back and do continual follow-ups. Well, it's up to the African people to continually follow up the governments using the media and whatever other tools they have at their disposal. We have to find those solutions ourselves. We can't rely on the rest of the world to do it for us.
And African and other developing countries cannot rely on the global news media either.
Conditions are more desperate than
Too often, the cameras only show up when it's too late, when people are dying, when it's a news story.
A deadly cocktail of successive droughts, armed conflicts, and rising food prices has put the most vulnerable at risk.
Here's how our Global Village voices see the coverage of famines in the media.
In the early days of global television news coverage, famines were an entirely new phenomenon to those in parts of the world who had never seen inhuman conditions in such vivid and graphic terms. Hence, it was labeled a story worth reporting. But after 2 decades, the image of the desperate African child with protruding ribs and flies buzzing about does not evoke the same empathy and emotions it used to.
Have we had any progress from that point in time? And are we always going to see Africa through this prism of a famine? We have famine fatigue, it seems to me. Every other day you switch the news, there's something happening, and it seems it's like a little bit like Hollywood. We have to have something bigger and better to catch our attention now.
If you'd like to join our growing list of Global Village Voices, here are 3 ways to let us know. You can email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net. You can go on Facebook and hook up with us through the Listening Post page there, or you can follow us through Twitter. Between Facebook and Twitter, we now have more than 3,000 viewers signed up. You can use any of those methods to find out what stories we're working on and how you can add your voice to the mix. We'll be going back to Ethiopia in the second half of the program, but first it's time for Listening Post News Bites. Almost everything about the internet is multilingual. The search engines, web pages, and social networking sites all cater to people speaking different languages. But one thing that has up until now been the exclusive domain of the Latin script is website addresses, despite the fact that more than half of the world's 1.6 billion net users communicate in languages that use different alphabets. But all of that is set to change as ICANN, the global regulatory body, Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, is set to open up the addresses to characters from other languages such as Arabic, Chinese, and Japanese. ICANN says that in the next month it will be ready to start receiving applications for new addresses, and that those addresses should be in use by the middle of 2010. There's a pro-Kremlin youth movement in Russia called Nashi, and it has taken issue with and legal action against Western news organizations. Nashi is suing 4 foreign newspapers for libel. Those papers, Britain's Independent, France's Le Monde, and Le Journal du Dimanche, and Germany's Frankfurter Rundschau, are all being taken to court for publishing an article that described Nashi's members as bandits and nationalists and compared the movement to the Hitler Youth in Nazi Germany. Nashi wants the contents of the article retracted, and it's demanding $500,000 rubles, that's about $17,000 US, in damages. Here's a line that will send a chill across the U.S. newspaper industry, particularly since it was written in a newspaper. The 2-decade erosion in newspaper circulation is looking more like an avalanche. Circulation in the U.S., which slid by 2% in 2005, 3% in 2006, and 4% in 2007, plummeted by more than 10% last year. The fall is being blamed on the economic downturn and the rise of the internet, and revenues and newsroom headcounts are also trending steeply downward. The biggest loser of readers was the San Francisco Chronicle. Its circulation was down by 28% last year. It's now less than half of what it was just 6 years ago. The American filmmaker Michael Moore has made some enemies in Venezuela, supporters of President Hugo Chavez.
Please welcome Michael Moore.
Moore did that while appearing on an American talk show, Jimmy Kimmel Live, which airs on ABC TV. Moore regaled the audience with an account of how he and Mr. Chavez shared a bottle or two of tequila while at the Venice Film Festival recently. Moore also said that he gave Chavez some advice on speech writing.
And so I turned on the TV last week when he spoke at the UN, and the first words out of his mouth were the exact words I'd written for him.
Chavez's supporters insist their man is a non-drinker and that he writes his own speeches. Their complaints about Moore's comments are another indication of how sensitive Chavistas are about what is said of their leader in American media. We're back after the break when the focus again will be on Ethiopia and the 1984 famine. Welcome back. Ethiopia, 1984, Part 2. That BBC News report we mentioned off the top, the one that triggered a global response, ran on October 24th of that year. The footage then made its way onto television screens all around the world and provoked ordinary people, politicians and celebrities into action. Within 12 months, over $100 million was raised and the foreign aid budgets of Western governments were increased. We want to take a closer look now at that initial BBC piece, because if the late Mohammed Amin, the Kenyan cameraman, were to shoot that same story today, the pictures would look a lot different. The Listening Post's Meenakshi Ravi now on historic images from a quarter-century ago, and why famine coverage in 2009 looks and sounds so different on our screens.
Dawn, and as the sun breaks through the piercing chill of night on the plain outside Coram, it lights up a biblical famine, now in the 20th century.
The sheer power of Michael Burke's report is something that you really cannot disregard.
Thousands of wasted people are coming here for help. Many find only death.
Until Michael Burke and Mohammed Amin's film came out, there were very few people who knew what was going on in Ethiopia.
The way that my father shot that footage, showing the dignity of the people, the massive suffering in their eyes, and the way that they were suffering there.
15,000 children here now, suffering, confused, lost.
When the pictures of the famine in Ethiopia played out on British television screens in 1984, they jolted viewers. The shocking reality of the situation in East Africa was laid before people's eyes, and it was a reality too grim to ignore.
Coram, an insignificant town, has become a place of grief.
They had never seen anything on that kind of scale before. So I think the sheer numbers blew people away completely.
I think that the reason that Michael Burke's piece had such impact at the time was because it was so brilliantly shot and was so dramatic.
There's not enough food for half these people. Rumours of a shipment can set off panic.
And if I can put it like this in rather crass terms, it was like an amazing piece of cinema, but with real people really suffering in real time.
The man behind the lens was Mohammed Amin, a Kenyan cameraman. His son Salim has his own theories on why the footage his father shot was so iconic.
I've asked numerous professionals, camera people, why was that different to the previous images of famine and suffering we had seen coming out of Africa? And I think the fact that he was an African filming Africans, I think that kind of, that connection, that empathy came across in those pictures.
Alongside Muhammad Amin was BBC reporter Michael Burke.
Ethiopia is turning into the worst human disaster for a decade.
His narration of the story of Ethiopia's starving millions set a benchmark for disaster reporting.
You know, it's all very well for me. I could smell it, taste it. You know, I had these close personal experiences. And you thought to yourself, how is somebody sitting in the comfort of their own living room, looking at this two-dimensional picture on the far side of the room, ever going to get the same sort of impression as I got at first hand?
You had Michael Burke's commentary, which was very powerful, and he's used the phrase a biblical famine, and that really spoke to people. It sounded apocalyptic and showed the extent to which Ethiopia was being ravaged.
What struck me most forcibly looking at this was these people and the way they acted, the way they dressed, and their Iron Age lifestyle reminded me vividly of the kind of Bibles we used to have at school. And they all had these colour pages with rather vivid and lifelike pictures of biblical scenes. I was trying to make the point that in a year where I don't think there's ever been such a superabundance of food in the world, that in the late 20th century, a biblical type famine should be occurring.
The situation is out of control.
Burke's report motivated news audiences in England to take notice and act.
This is ABC News coverage.
In the United States, however, Ethiopia's famine was hardly to be seen on TV screens.
The polls are closing as I think.
Initially, they actually refused the pictures, said we're not interested, it's election year, another famine in Africa, who cares? It was only when Viz News, the agency that had the pictures, pushed very hard to just satellite the pictures into New York, and it completely silenced the entire newsroom when these pictures came in.
Good evening once again from New York.
Tom Brokaw was the anchor at that time. I remember somebody turning to him and saying, if we don't put these pictures on, we shouldn't be in this business.
Muhammad Amin's footage affected viewers on both sides of the Atlantic. But were he and Michael Burke covering a famine today, the report would likely have been very different, starting with some of the camera angles.
For example, at Save the Children, you would never ever see a picture of a child taken from above. You have to take it from the same level as the child, because you're talking about the child's perspective, not a matter of an adult taking a picture down on this little victim.
I don't go along with that kind of thesis that this was some sort of visual giving away of the essential paternalism in the relationship between the reporter, the cameraman on the one side, and the people on the other. If somebody's dying, they're lying down. And I don't need to be lying down with them in order to get the best shot of what's going on.
People scrabble in the dirt as they go.
It's not just the footage that would have been shot differently.
How do you feel about
the report itself would have sounded different, fundamentally different.
Just I am a witness of Korem.
When you see the Burke report, there is 7 minutes, and the only people who speak in it are Michael Burke himself and a doctor from Médecins Sans Frontières.
If there is no food,
you would never see that in a report today.
The one thing that I regret more than anything else, it never crossed my mind for a moment to interview anybody who couldn't speak English, because I knew they wouldn't use it. And the culture at the time, you know, there was no way that you would either put subtitles up on a mainstream news program, or even what we call voiceover. And so consequently, all the victims, all the people the story was about were voiceless.
That was then, but even now, by today's standards, this was an iconic piece of journalism, an epic, tragic story told in a way that affected millions, from the people who gave to the lives that were saved.
More Global Village Voices now on the coverage of Ethiopia back in 1984.
I think he brought into millions of homes around the world the true visceral impact of what exactly was happening in Ethiopia. The images of the starving families and starving children brought home the true extent of the famine perhaps not so many crusading journalists like Michael Burke in the world anymore, and if they are, they're not doing their jobs properly.
In 1984, the world witnessed the reality of famine on a massive scale. The footage we saw could well have been scenes from the Old Testament, but what gave this particular impact was the fact that these images were being beamed back virtually live, direct into our own comfortable and well-fed lives. Suddenly, we couldn't pretend we didn't know, or that it was all too far away to do anything about. Somebody had to do something.
Finally, you may not have heard of auto-tune,
but chances are you've heard the effects of auto-tune.
Auto-tune is something called a proprietary audio processor. It's designed to take musical performances that are flawed vocally and instrumentally and subtly correct imperfect pitch. So singers,
particularly those who can't really sing, love auto-tune.
It's become standard equipment in recording studios around the world. However, mischief makers on the internet like to use it too, because they can take some of the driest political speeches or news broadcasts and presto, turn them into songs. Our web video of the week is an example of how auto-tune can upgrade news content. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
Seamos un pelín mejores y un poco menos egoístas. Huele esperanza. In this common endeavor, huele esperanza. All of us work together. We must embrace a new era of engagement because the time has come. For trust to be sustained, it has to be shared. Oh, we can smell the hope. The time has come. A better world to live in for future generations everywhere.
How is the Nobel Peace Prize decided?
Well, that is what people were asking all day today.
We mix a secret potion and roll the ancient dice, then hire a focus group and have a human sacrifice.
A lot of people are asking today, why do you think the committee selected President Obama?
I believe a prize for peace should go to the biggest ones.
They're giving Obama a prize for not being George Bush.
They can smell the hope. Take a deep breath and hold the smelly world. Deep breath.
A better world to live in for future generations everywhere.